This week on Just Solutions. With the holidays approaching, many people are faced with the prospect of having difficult conversations with friends and family who may be spreading misinformation on everything from politics to COVID. The World Health Organization has called the spread of misinformation around the coronavirus an infodemic that is costing lives. Challenging loved ones on this issue can be difficult, but there are ways to speak up. Hannah Waltz, US Free Expression Programs Coordinator at PEN America, joins us to give us advice on how to have those difficult conversations. PEN America has led a series of virtual media literacy activities, part of its response to the ongoing threat of misinformation. From Free Speech TV, Just Solutions. Hannah, it's great to have you with us, and what a timely conversation. People will potentially be gathering with friends and loved ones for the first time in possibly a couple of years because of the pandemic, and so some of those difficult conversations could come to the fore. PEN America, as I said, has been really trying to arm people with correct information, but also with tools on how to combat misinformation and how to have some of those difficult conversations. So when we're talking about misinformation, how big is scope? Gives a sense of the broad nature of this problem. What is the scope of it?
Sure. And first of all, thank you so much for having me. It's really great to be here representing PEN America. Just a huge fan of the show. And it's a huge question, the scope, right? Mainly because the scope of the issue is in near constant flux. We're, kind of emerging right now from this period of time that was incredibly isolating for people. It was also a period of total uncertainty, and information overload. And so these factors alone really paved the way for misinformation to, take advantage of that panic that, people feel and offer folks something to hold on to, even if it's false. On top of that, social media news feeds have become so individualized that sometimes it's hard to know for sure what others, including your family and friends, are seeing or reading on their feeds. That said, of course, we know that a significant percentage of the American population is still exposed to misinformation, be it about the 2020 election results or about treatments for COVID. And it's always a really good reminder for us all that, it's easy to exist in these echo chambers of like-minded people. And that really works in misinformation's favor. It's designed to confuse people, to drive people to apathetic, distrustful mindsets, and truly engineered to polarize us in that way. So, we can talk about this a little bit later, but when people feel disenfranchised or ignored by powerful people or institutions, they're prone to look elsewhere, right? So this leads to that polarization that I mentioned. And there's also plenty of evidence that polarization and misinformation go hand in hand. We also know that some communities are directly targeted with disinformation. Often these are communities that are historically underserved by the news media, like Spanish language communities, for example, communities of color, rural communities, and other communities where news deserts may be more likely to exist. And misinformation really has that easy inroad to fill in gaps in coverage.
That's such a good point, Hannah, because I know that there was a lot of research done ahead of last year's presidential election to show that communities of color were specifically targeted within misinformation, and that it was most successful, if you want to use that word, in terms of the reach of misinformation when there were these information gaps. And so when you have communities that are largely underserved by the media, whose stories aren't being told, whose real life experiences aren't being reflected, it makes them very, very vulnerable then when these misinformation campaigns come forward. And some of those studies showed that a lot of that misinformation targeted, say, the Latinx community ahead of last year's election to sort of really foster the sense of apathy that, well, there's no point in showing up to vote. What's the point? And so it is very, very harmful when we look at specifically those communities that are really being targeted by that.
Yes, definitely. And again, misinformation plays on that distrust. it seeks to preserve those societal inequities. And it, also we've seen with vaccine misinformation that it can take advantage of that historical, very valid historical distrust of the medical system, And so what we've been doing at PEN America is really working with different communities, including different communities of color, to combat vaccine misinformation. And really empower folks to feel connected and empowered to seek their own information out. I think it's a big part of the reason that we frame media literacy as an equity issue, as a social justice issue, and seeking to level out the playing field and making sure that people have those tools that they can use to access accurate information, which can keep communities healthy, of course.
That's a very good point in terms of how medical misinformation can spread. And as we heard in the intro, the World Health Organization has labeled it an infodemic, like a pandemic of lack of information or misinformation. And, when we're not hearing stories about real life health inequities being reported, there is that distrust then from communities who have been not well served by mainstream medical communities. And so you can see how the flames of misinformation can be fanned when you've got both of those things going on. And so with so many people having access to social media in a way that really we couldn't even have imagined 5 years ago, being compounded by the isolation that people have been through because of the pandemic, it seems that misinformation is spreading even more. So is social media really what's the game changer here, as opposed to what we're reading in newspapers, what we're seeing on TV? Is it social media where we're really seeing the misinformation spreading far and wide?
I mean, sure. I think there's no simple answer to that question. And I think it's useful to focus on, uplifting the voices of folks who have credible information, of people who are trusted in those communities. So, we know in our holistic approach to media literacy and to attacking the misinformation problem, what we do need to do is work with our lawmakers, with social media platforms, in tandem with educators, journalists, and newsrooms, with community organizers, to have that really truly multi-pronged, multidisciplinary approach. It's really the only way. And of course, we should advocate for legislation that supports media literacy in schools and that prioritizes support for local journalism. But it really boils back down to that issue of trust. You're much more likely to trust something that your family member or your friend says on social media, for example. We're in this very volatile moment where we're in an information overload moment, right? And so where do we turn? We're kind of spinning as a society, trying to figure out what the best solutions are. But I really think that, going back to the social media part, I think we need to be proactive in the way that we hold platforms accountable. We try to bring some nuance to this point at PEN America, because they're social media platforms are private companies that are not actually bound by the First Amendment, meaning that they have the right to set their own policies. But we do believe that they have a responsibility to mitigate harm caused by disinformation. That said, social media platforms are also a very important public platform, right, for debate and creativity, global communication. So it's really important that they're careful when they're taking actions to not have that silencing effect. Again, I think it would be useful to shift this debate to talk more about the algorithms and how certain content is amplified. We can talk a little bit later about how, engagement is actually the main problem of this issue when it comes to the rapid spread of disinformation online. So I think it would be, again, helpful to support community voices, uplifting those journalists, community organizers, especially, with regards to vaccine misinformation. in communities of color, uplift those voices that folks already trust, that are sharing credible information. So, in addition to speaking up and holding social media platforms accountable, we really need to also beef up our own community-driven defense here.
Well, that's what PEN America really has been doing, in seeking out these community voices that are trusted, that are credible sources of information, and hosting, I know, a whole series of Q&As and virtual panel discussions, bringing everyone from psychologists to tech experts to educators and journalists together to speak to specific communities about what misinformation looks like and how it's showing up in their community. So what are you hearing when you're doing these discussions, when you're out there and you're talking to people? What are you hearing about misinformation?
Sure. So I think it's helpful for a little bit of context. We began this program in January of 2020. This was really a totally different world, right? And so our programming and resources have really had to evolve and move in sync with the times in order to be responsive to what's occupying people's minds and news feeds as it relates to misinformation. So, last year we were hearing a lot about how do we talk to family and friends about COVID-19 misinformation. We talked about false rumors about the protests in response to George Floyd's murder last summer and against police brutality. And of course, election misinformation in the lead up to last November. And so I think we can all kind of agree that information systems were having this, moment, and not in a good way. And so we stepped in with proactive solutions in response to this. This year has looked a little bit different. I think there's, a level of public awareness of the problem of misinformation. But I think, like I said earlier, we're kind of swirling as a society about what to do about it. And so, right, there's no golden key, but we do know that trusted messengers can play a huge role at the community level, which is what we've really been focused on. Working with community leaders, be it librarians, community organizers, and faith leaders, to really equip folks with the strategies to then go and seed media literacy skills in their own communities, especially with regards to vaccine information. And, once again, working in particular with communities of color who we know have been targeted by disinformation and taken advantage of existing historical distrust. And I think it's important also to make a distinction between, susceptibility to disinformation versus targeting. I think that it can be useful sometimes to correct the narrative a little bit there. It's not necessarily a susceptibility, but a targeting when it comes to different communities falling for misinformation. There's a targeting to, again, preserve that inequity. And it may be a broken record at this point, but I really think it's important to really drive home the point that sowing distrust and confusion is really the name of the game when it comes to misinformation. It can be easy to get caught up on details of a single issue. I can't believe so-and-so believes this or doesn't realize that that's clearly false misinformation. And it can be easy to be cynical about the media or to opt to just kind of hang out in this universal skepticism to avoid being duped. But ultimately, these are all, just distractions from this larger issue of polarizing communities that, can't agree upon a shared sense of truth or reality. And that's where the rubber really hits the road for disinformation. Confusion and distrust can lead to that apathy, which can lead to disempowerment. And bam, that's the whole point. And so that's where we come in and try to repair this trust. And, so a lot of our work revolves around that question of bringing in trust and empowerment, and bringing in community leaders in conversation with journalists and misinformation experts who understand kind of the psychological mechanics of misinformation and why it works. So it's bringing things together, right? It's bringing media literacy skills, connecting with and empowering trusted messengers and communities, and supporting local news outlets, supporting community and ethnic media, and all of these things working together can really build up and restore that trust that's been so damaged by disinfo.
Well, so many studies have shown that local news rates and ranks very high in people's trust when we talk about trust in the media, but also somebody in the community or a friend or a family member that they trust. So that's why it's such an important conversation that we're having today, Hannah. When people have this opportunity to engage one-on-one with people, what they might be able to do to combat some of this misinformation. But we would love to hear from some of our viewers. Let us know your thoughts on this. We have folks watching on YouTube, on Facebook, on Twitter, all across social media as well. But we'd love to hear, are you dreading or looking forward to maybe engaging with loved ones around some of these difficult issues? Because Hannah, often I think, instinct is to let's have a calm Thanksgiving, let's have a calm get together, no discussions around politics, money, religion, the usual things that were often left aside at the dinner table. That's not necessarily the best approach, though. So if, for example, a real life situation, you're sitting at a dinner table and somebody brings something up, is the best thing to let it go, not engage in an argument? Or are there strategies where conversations could be had that could actually be constructive or maybe effective?
There are strategies indeed. And first, I just want to say that if you're feeling this way, you're 1,000% not alone. One of the most popular resources we've created for folks is our tip sheet on how to talk to family and friends who share misinformation. And we created it in response to that number one question that we were asked in our workshops last year, this year, especially in our strategic dialogue conversations with community leaders. It's an issue. So first of all, you're not alone. And there's a reason. So I think it's important to remember how it works, right? So before you engage in this conversation, know that misinformation can be sexy, right? It can be appealing to people for a variety of reasons. It operates, though, in this super nuanced space. So conversations are hard. They can be divisive and sometimes cutting through relationships. So you need to be prepared. And every relationship is different. So we try to avoid being too prescriptive. But okay, I'm going to go into some of our tips that we do give. So one, if you decide to approach someone in your family, your friends who believes or shares some form of misinformation, it is important to do so with compassion, empathy, and consideration for their perspective. Hard stop. Then make 100% sure that what they're saying or sharing is false. So remember that misinformation can affect everyone. So it's a good place to kind of center. And then take care not to invalidate their concerns. There's likely a very real reason that they believe this, what you believe to be misinformation, and you don't want to alienate them or give off any form of combative energy. Aim for a private conversation, so maybe no yelling across the dinner table if you can avoid it, and try to parse out why they believe whatever misinformation you're discussing and work from there. It's about listening here. Other things like you can do, and aim to do this in a non-patronizing way, right? Gently direct them to credible, nonpartisan sources. You can even maybe explain to them why misinformation works, address some of the psychological components of it if you feel comfortable. The more you encounter certain information, for example, the more likely you are to believe it, even if it's false. The point is that this is a very human tendency, and not a conservative leaning or liberal tendency, but something that can affect any of us. And this can really help level the playing field. And it's important to bring that at least to the fore of your own internal convo, if not to the conversation that you're having. So, and then finally, we always say avoid escalation. Remember, this is about protecting yourself, but also protecting those relationships. Changing attitudes does not happen overnight, and there's no need to stress yourself out about this. There's no need to be a hero and change minds before dessert, but, do be a resource. The importance of trusted messengers here, that would be you with your family, even if it maybe doesn't seem like it, it really cannot be overstated. So, this close relationship, also to keep in mind, may also mean that they're more comfortable supplying a rebuttal to something that you have to say. So it's very smart to have an exit plan, but always concentrate on your approach with compassion and the consistency of your message. So we always say lead with the truth, explain why the misinformation is in question is wrong, and then repeat the truth. We sometimes call this the truth sandwich. And the positive effect of receiving, that message from somebody you trust is really everything.
That idea of going in with a sense of empathy, I think, is huge, because I think that's where in-person conversations, in real life encounters differ so much from what's happening on social media, where there's just no nuance there. In person, you can go in with that sense of empathy. And one of the big tips I've gotten from watching all of the Pen America Q&As, and I really can't recommend them enough on this, is to go in without the attitude that you're going to win an argument. Because so often we do go into these encounters thinking, I'm going to change this person's mind. There's a zero-sum attitude where I will win and therefore you will lose. And no one will ever change anybody's mind if you go in with that mindset. But one of the big tips that I heard from psychologists, educators, and journalists as part of the Pen America forums was go in and ask, why do you believe that? Where did you get that information? And why does that resonate with you? So asking questions can give that sense of you're not dismissing this person outright, but you're actually willing to engage with them.
Exactly. And I think that that listening component can really be one of the biggest game changers. Um, I think, I think going in with a sense of humility too, is really important, as we're having these conversations especially with our family and friends. They there's a level of respect there that you can lean into, and not necessarily come in with like a mightier than thou attitude, or holier than thou, whatever you want to say. And I think it can, setting the stage energy wise, it can just make all the difference. And so that's without getting too psychological about it all, I think it's important to remember all that, and remember that misinformation totally thrives on those heated, fiery vibes that we can bring to divisive conversations. And so you can kind of diffuse and neuter that power if you come in with more of a calm sense of conversation. Yeah, and go ahead.
Well, that term nuance keeps coming up and resonating with
Yes.
me as we were discussing this. We talked about how there's so often a lack of nuance on social media, but often a lack of nuance in even mainstream media reporting, so that it doesn't always acknowledge the lived experiences of certain communities. And so if we are having these conversations, to acknowledge, yes, understand that different communities have had a very different life experience than I may have had, and so you're perceiving a lot of the information that's coming at you in a very different way. I think we're often missing that nuance, even in mainstream reputable news coverage as well.
Yes, definitely. I think I sometimes when I talk about this, and I want to embrace it, but sometimes when I talk about misinformation, it starts to feel a little therapy-esque. But I think it's really important to acknowledge that part too, right? Because so much of this is about what you experience as reality. And there may be very, very real reasons. Say you're speaking to somebody who has had a really traumatic experience with the medical industry, for example. That is something that is deep seated, and so there may be misinformation that is actually very affirming to their experience. And so you have to really come in with some kindness there, and not be like, well, no. So I really think it's important to use that framework and to just be kind about it. And remember that you're having a human to human interaction. It can really be that simple. On the note of nuance, if I may, I think that we really try to keep this in mind at Pen America as this nonprofit, nonpartisan organization. So in terms of disinformation, we try to really walk this line. And if it's okay, I'd like to kind of outline our framework in terms of how we think about disinformation as a threat to free speech and expression. So, we look at it as undermining the way we connect with each other. And so this kind of goes back to that human connection. Disinformation can distort the very meaning of the language that we use. And in the same breath, I'll say that it's definitely true that some responses to disinformation also have the potential to censor or chill freedom of expression. And part of why we work on this issue is to bring a voice to that debate, that nuanced voice, to ensure that we offer responses to propose solutions that don't infringe on free speech. And so it's really about walking that line. And I think this can relate to personal interactions that you have too, right? You want somebody to feel free to express themselves to you so that you can really understand their mindset. That's going to pave the way for you to have a productive conversation with them. And so, you know, media literacy can bring us to that point of, you know, it's a solution. It's one part of the solution, and a very proactive response to the threats that mis and disinformation pose, which includes threatening some of our relationships. So, you know, we really believe that access to accurate information, to fact-based information, is part and parcel of everyone's free expression and First Amendment rights. And media literacy can help get us there, especially as it pertains to having these conversations with loved ones in our life. So I just wanted to kind of make that connection because it is all connected. You know, the way that we consume information, the way that we understand that others consume information, it can bring that empathy really to the fore.
That's a great point to make, Hannah. And just in the last few moments that we've spoken a lot about those in real life encounters that potentially will be happening over the holidays. You may be sitting around a dinner table. There's a whole different opportunity to engage. However, if you are engaging with loved ones or friends online, there's a slightly different way to approach it. And I just want to touch on this briefly because you mentioned this term amplification. When we repeat misinformation and it gets repeated, even if we're repeating it because we're trying to counteract it, we have to be very careful about that. So talk a little bit about what amplification is and just some of the things to be wary of when we're trying to engage like this on social media.
Sure, of course. You know, when we came out with this tip sheet, it was very much in this virtual age where folks were pretty much only interacting online. And so I think it is really important to remember that you know, like you said, the approaches need to be different. You know, there's a lot of talk about algorithms, and I think that in this moment, I would like to just highlight that most social media companies have engineered these algorithms to promote and amplify content that is engaged with. And so, you know, some of the reports about Facebook that came out after the whistleblower was that, you know, some of those algorithms were rewarding people who were reacting with either the heart react or the angry react, and bringing those, you know, rewarding those, but bringing them up, amplifying them in folks' feeds as opposed to just the simple like. And so this really speaks to that engagement. So if you see something that you think is maybe misinformation, maybe it makes you feel a certain way really intensely, that's a good alarm bell to have going off in your mind. But it's important to know that if you are going to go into that conversation and on the virtual stage, right, keep in mind that it may be more useful to have a private or to start a private message. If you engage with misinformation in the public feed, right, it's just going to bring it up, even if it's just a comment, even if you're trying to correct somebody. And so I think there's another advantage of having that private message. First of all, of course, it doesn't add to the amplification, but second of all, you avoid shaming someone publicly. That can be that can drive somebody in the opposite direction. So again, it comes back to that element of empathy. And so if you can have that private conversation, they're going to be much more receptive to you, and you're going to avoid amplifying the misinformation.
Well, PEN America has so much information and tip sheets for people to engage with others online, in real life, in a variety of different forums. And it's all at their website. There are also many, many online forums that you've hosted, which has lots of tips. And I know you have some more coming up as well. So we would definitely let people know. check out Pen America's website, because that's where you can find all of that information. In the meantime, Hannah Waltz, thank you so much for being with us on Just Solutions.
Thank you so much, Maeve. It's been a pleasure. Everyone stay safe.
And don't forget that Just Solutions is now available as a podcast. So subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. You can listen again, listen anytime, and listen to past episodes of Just Solutions. And join us again for another conversation on Just Solutions. Same time, same place. From Free Speech TV, Just Solutions, I'm Maeve Conran.